first of all, I just want to say, first and foremost, I want to express my heartfelt thanks to AFA. The work that your group is doing is, frankly, it's been my life's work. And I came into this commission really from the point of view of a workforce practitioner. My background actually is I come from the private sector. And actually, before joining this commission and as the chair, I was the CEO of a company called Catalyte, which was one of the early companies that was doing registered apprenticeships in the world of software development and tech. And through that process, but even before then, I spent 25 years before Catalyte actually building engineering and software development centers all over the world, building, R&D labs all over the world. And so this idea of talent pipelines and actually how you're able to find people from, non-traditional, quote unquote, non-traditional backgrounds who maybe didn't come through the same types of feeder programs that we're used to. I saw them through the work and through employer-led and sponsored training and apprenticeships. We're able to get people to become world-class engineers and in some cases, incredible entrepreneurs as well. And so I came into Catalyte, I came into the apprenticeship world really having done apprenticeships at scale, thousands and thousands of engineers overseas. And so these fundamental first principles of how you actually build talent, how you actually stack up these skills so that you can actually be relevant and valuable in this world of very fast changing occupations is something that I've been very familiar with. And so today, look, I also came into this process really believing that this more than ever was the unique point in time in our economy where apprenticeships could become the answer, right, for the workforce challenges of our future. I probably don't have to talk about on this call, right, the evolving, the unprecedented pace, right, and change and transformation that's reshaping industries and redefining skills in real time. I probably don't have to talk about, right, the fact that employers continue to struggle to find talent, right, while too many workers are unemployed or underemployed or burdened by debt and from education and training programs that kind of led to nowhere. And look, for decades now, like we've all debated how best to bridge this gap, right? There's been lots of experiments with boot camps and micro-credentials and reskilling, yet still, this kind of skills gap continues to persist. At the same time, so, we know that fundamental problem. And I think that problem was something that we came in here with a really clear understanding of. But we also understood the opportunity, right? And I think one of the reasons why this commission, I think, was so comprehensive and why I think we went deeper and further into apprenticeships than other things I've seen is that, I firmly believe that one of the most powerful solutions that we have for modernizing and expanding our the workforce that's truly future ready is apprenticeships, right? And I think our apprenticeships is the right model, right? And as we start to think about how do we adapt or take some of those first principles that have come from traditional apprenticeships and be able to apply them into these rapidly growing and evolving fields across, cyber, tech, IT, healthcare, clean energy, even education itself, this is actually that moment in time where we can actually realign some of these incentives and realign some of the economics that can actually make these apprenticeships more of a real mainstream hiring strategy versus something that's really kind of a pilot or a nice or sort of an impact project. So that was really kind of the approach. One of the amazing things about our commission is that I do think we had an incredibly broad set of thought leaders and experts here. Again, I'm a practitioner coming from the world of the employer side, but I was also, it was really, I think the commission over the 2 years, we all learned a lot from each other's commission members. So we had representatives clearly from government. So we had senators, we had delegates, we had people, representatives from organized labor, from employers, from education. And so I think we were able to sort of really bring together a collection of commission members that I think really represented some of the best thinking across different stakeholders for this. So really starting from the goal of the commission, right? So this commission was established, it was really the expansion of something that actually came before, which was called the Blueprint for Maryland's Future, which was really an education strategy. But we were really looking at how, the purpose of the commission was how do we reduce skill shortages in high demand occupations and really ensure that we can actually create a much more affordable method for getting people into the career pathways of the future. So the first goal was really, again, expanding the registered apprenticeship model, right? And really expanding it into other industries that traditionally haven't seen registered apprenticeships in them. Growing the number of registered apprenticeships to at least 60,000 by 2030, which is about a 5x uplift from where we are today. And reaching the blueprint goal, there was a goal that was laid out in the blueprint that came before us of 45% of high school graduates having completed a high school level of a registered apprenticeship by the time they graduate. And so those were the three high-level goals that really became the way for us to kind of truly create a forcing function for us to really think about, to narrow our focus in terms of the scope that we were of the problem. The commission went for about a little over under 2 years. If we go to the next slide here, Harry, you can sort of see the timeline of what we did over that period of time, right? And so, as I mentioned from the outside, we had 25 committee members on the commission. We broke this out. Initially, in the first year, we had 4 working groups that expanded to 60 working groups in the second year. We had 12 public meetings that actually happened, that occurred, where we actually had hearings, where we actually had feedback from both commission members and from public constituents. We ended up doing an interim report in the first year that laid out some of the key areas of investigation that we want to dive deeper into the second year. And the second year really became, I'd say, a true working level of study of best practices, principles, and just understanding what works. And so that led to site visits with practitioners. That led to an international trip where we went to the UK and Germany. We had an employer roundtable. We actually had a number of different, we had a number of visits with the employers and practitioners across different industries as well. We did a survey, right, which I think it's also included in our report, that was very comprehensive in terms of how employers and organized labor, what their intentions and what their thoughts and feedback was on apprenticeships and registered apprenticeships and the outlook. And again, we were able to plug in with lots of different thought leaders. So aside from the 25 committee members, we had thought leaders from all around the world, including many of your thought leaders from AFA, helping us to really guide us through this process to really hone our final recommendations. And when we just published our final report, actually, I guess technically early last week, with a final set of 23 recommendations. And so if we go to the next slide here, Harry, we can talk a little bit about sort of probably what were some of the goals, right? And so here you sort of see the recommendations, but I want to kind of sort of, kind of zoom out a little bit, right? And so I think first, one of the things that came in here, and I think this was something that was, again, we came in here with a lot of thought leaders who are already familiar with workforce and apprenticeships. And so one of the first things that I think we all aligned on is like, we're not looking to do more train and pray models, right? So we all know there's been lots and lots of training models where it's really been driven by the training process, but it hasn't really connected to sort of the right outcomes, right? And so we were really coming into this with the goal of, we need evidence-based, outcome-driven recommendations, right? So this goal isn't to just spin up more mandates, spin up more things that you should try. It was really focused on how do we make sure that we connect this to the right outcomes. And so because of that, we actually broke our commission into a couple of key themes, right? First side, as you can see here, activating employer demand, right? So, and the word activating is a key one, right? Because, it wasn't creating demand, because the demand's already there, right? We already know, right? There's a skills gap. There's employers who need workforce, right? Employers who need to tap into this talent pool. How do we enable employers to be able to activate that demand, to be able to activate registered apprenticeships as a mainstream strategy for addressing that demand? There was also the side of activating the supply side, the learner side, right? And a lot of there, it was also focused on how do we remove barriers, right? It's not just about how to create more incentives and accelerators. How do we remove barriers that are preventing people, especially young people, from being able to choose apprenticeships as a potential opportunity for them? We looked at, of course, funding scale up. So how do you use public tools and accelerators to be able to incentivize? One thing that is that we also spent a lot of time first year and second year was also really better understanding of the broader ecosystem, right? And when I say ecosystem, we're really talking about intermediaries. But even the concept of intermediaries was a little bit fuzzy coming into this process, right? So really defining what is an intermediary and what do they do, and how do we ensure the high quality standards for intermediaries. And finally, and I think this is a part that is probably unique to our commission, was we began this with a real focus on data, insights, and accountability. And I'm really glad that Avanette is on this call because on this webinar, because she also was the leader, she was the chair of that particular working group. And again, I want to reinforce that again. Why did we have data, insights, and accountability? Is because we need evidence-based, we need outcome-driven recommendations. So through this process, you know, I can talk about any of the particular recommendations, but you know, I can stop there for a moment and sort of just see if there's questions or feedback before we get into particular recommendations.
I don't see any questions in the chat. And as you make your way through the presentation, folks can add those questions to the chat, Jake, and we can let you and Jim field those together. Thank you.
Great. I see one question up. Should I answer that first, Demetrius? Or?
Yes, good afternoon. Real quick, Jake, just wanted to know, were you guys able to segment out the different types of apprenticeships, whether they be IT versus the more traditional apprenticeship pathways?
That's a great question, Demetrius. And I'll tell you, this is one of those things that I personally learned when I came in here, right? Is that we did not necessarily do that by industry or occupation. And simply being is that we wanted to find a way to identify those first principles and best practices that can be broadly applied. Now, I do think it's an important point, though, is that as we got into this process, at first, I'll tell you, in the first year, I think there was more diverging of some of those kind of thoughts. But I think by the second year, as we've spent a lot more time together, and especially as we went through a number of these rounds where we're actually visiting with practitioners and we actually went to different industries. For example, we did one site visit in the Eastern Shore that was really focused on the traditional trades and traditional registered apprenticeship programs. We did another one in Baltimore City that was really focused on IT and cyber and some of the new tech world that's coming. We also had some representatives in life sciences and things that are coming in. So by the second year, as we started to explore and had different commission members kind of really understand how these apprenticeship models are working in other industries and how they're being applied, you started seeing things start to converge again, right? And and we could talk about how that's landed in some of the recommendations later. But I do think, like, through that process, I think that I think we came together in a good way in the end.
Thank you. Good to know.
Could I add something? The recommendations of the commission don't address industry or occupational segments, but the analysis in the report, the background information in the report, does actually do that. Our State Department of Labor and Bob Lehrman with the Urban Institute, the chair of the AFA board, worked together to come up with, if you're going to get to 60,000 apprentices, you know, ballpark, what's going to be in hospitality, what's going to be in logistics, what's going to be in business services, what's going to be in IT. So there is data in there on that.
Yeah, and I think on that point we can maybe, Jim, we could talk about maybe the first one, right? It was really you know, when we were really thinking about this goal, right? I think there was some debate around the goal of 60,000. And this was something that I think was, you know, certainly for some of our stakeholders on the commission, was something that was really, really important, was that we did not want to back off of that, right? And I'll say that and the reason being is that, again, I go back again to the demand is already there for workforce, right? The issue is, how do we actually address that demand? How do we activate that demand with the registered apprenticeship model? And so when we started looking at that, like, you know, look, I've spent most of my career in technology. Things have a tendency to grow slowly until they stop growing slowly, and then they grow really fast and they grow asymptotically, right? And when we kind of looked at across the industry, we could just see, like, if you look at the world of cyber in our state, every month we had a net deficit of 8,000 to 9,000 cyber jobs that are not being filled, right? And so when you start looking at those kinds of numbers, right, you know, when you start to think future back of where the need is, and you kind of connect it back to the available supply, there's more than demand to do this. The real question again was, how do we ensure that we have the right principles and the right models that we can abstract that enables this to happen?
There's another question in the chat from Freddie Rollison. Are employers becoming more encouraged to hire people with solely a diploma and apprenticeship credential, or is there still higher demand for college degree requirements just for entry-level positions? Let me briefly respond to that from the commission perspective, and Jake, dive in if you. Basically, the commission was very clear that apprenticeships are for everybody. If they're in occupations where there are degree requirements, they become degree apprenticeships. But it's an independent variable, apprenticeships for all.
Yeah, and I don't want to sort of, I don't want to give the cop-out answer, but it really depends, right? And so I could say, like, it depends on the employer. As a practitioner myself, you know, I've worked with a lot of big employers who've done software and tech apprenticeships, and it really varies employer to employer. You know, so and on that front, really around the point around the variances, like, so we were able to abstract out a couple recommendations around key standards, right, and key things that I think are applicable to across a lot of different industries. But importantly, a real substantive one that we created is that, you know, we are recommending to create a Maryland Office of Registered Apprenticeship Development, MORAD, right, that sits under our Department of Labor. And with by the way, an advisory committee consisting of employers, union leadership, and legislators. And the goal of that is to tailor, right, these apprenticeship standards for different industries. And also to continually, you know, and this began with really this goal, again, of we need to own that number. That 60,000 target, or really we landed on, it's not quite 60, it's 2.3% of our state workforce, which works out to be about 60,000. That number really we need to be accountable for achieving that number. And the way that you do it is that we have to be a lot more responsive industry to industry to adapt these registered apprenticeship programs so we can better fit the needs of those industries. You know, in the world of intermediaries, right, we really wanted to incentivize multi-employer intermediaries, right? You know, it was a really big deal not to just create, you know, not to just like subsidize corporate training, right? These needed to be, you know, we wanted multi-employer registered apprenticeships that drive the right outcomes. I think a big one, right, which was something that Senator Rosapep was a huge proponent of from the very beginning, which really is something that I think we also adapted from what we learned from practitioners overseas, was really adopting a pay per apprenticeship model, right? So again, let's make this outcome driven. Let's not incentivize people just to put more people into training. Let's really make sure that this is connected to outcomes, right, that are connecting to the real outcomes we want to see, which is that people have success in these careers and occupations, right? You know, an area that was near to dear of my heart, which I came in here with, was, you know, how do we start to create public service and public sector apprenticeships, right? Our own state, right? And, you know, this is not a strategy, it was not intentional, but, you know, the way that we hire, right, in our own state government was antiquated and was not, it made it very difficult, right, to make registered apprenticeships work. You know, and it's not intentional. So, you know, even our previous administration had already gotten quote unquote degree requirements. The reality is that they're still in the job requirements. They're still in the requirements that people have for entry-level talent, right? And so there's sort of there's sort of a need for driving some more alignment around some of these key strategies, right? One thing that I personally I personally thought was the one thing that could change everything, that could really catalyze apprenticeships, certainly in our state, was, and especially in this year now when we have, you know, tremendous sort of budget concerns, right? Given what's going on in the federal government and we have a balanced budget state, how do we make the state a better customer, right? How do we use procurement? How do we become a much more intentional, better customer and use procurement as a way of actually driving more registered apprenticeships in our state? And so one of the recommendations that we made, that is actually a bill that I think is going up in this session, is changing our procurement laws. There was already, by the way, a requirement in building and trades for the state to be able to use registered apprenticeships in the, you know, like the vendors who are actually delivering services to the state use registered apprenticeships in the delivery of work to the state. Well, we recommend that we expand that across all industries. So all vendors who are doing work for the state, including IT and cyber and these industries of the future like data centers and clean energy, should be using registered apprenticeships in the delivery of work to the state, right? And so those were some of the things that we started to really think about. Is like we were really trying to get down to strategies that could really catalyze and change the ecosystem and realign the incentives, versus again, kind of continuing to kind of just like grind out more training, grind out more of what came before.
And thank you, Jake, for that really comprehensive overview of the commission's work. We've got a few more questions in the sidebar, but I'm just going to bring in Adrian, who's going to ask Jake and Jim a few questions and help moderate the questions that are coming through. But please continue to put things in the sidebar and we'll put them up.
Yeah, thanks, Harry, and thanks, Jake, for that incredible overview. Is there, well, I'll hold on asking you more questions, but I do want to introduce Jim as well. And you've already, you here in our webinar today have gotten the spirit of things, so please keep your questions coming because, I think this intersection of policy and practitioners is a really, really important one to double down on right now. And not only do we have Jim and Jake and other experts here, but you have each other to call on for resources and figuring out how to continue to build these pipelines effectively and efficiently for both apprentices and businesses and our workforce needs in each of our states. So yeah, keep the questions coming. I'm Adrian Andrews, Executive Director of Maryland Workforce Alliance. We're a membership organization representing a range of unions, trades, and management organizations. And we also have appreciated Senator Rosapep here in Maryland. I want to introduce him a little bit. He's a longtime advocate for Maryland workers and apprenticeships on a local and national level. So we're grateful you can be a part of this conversation. And I do also just want to give a big thanks to Jim and Jake and the intentionality you all took with this 2-year process. As you outlined, Jake, your experience as a business owner, I think, was an important part of this conversation, and your ability to ask good questions, because I think we do come in with a script when we're giving these orders from the governor and saying, run forth into the future. But I think you did a really good job of bringing the right people to the table, from what I can tell. But I do want to do, kind of ask Jim, bring you into this conversation and just do a quick look back because of your experience here. And I'm just curious, how you see this commission's work now. How is it different from what Maryland has done in the past? How is it building on things we've learned? And what is encouraging to you about this current report that you all are about to release, Jim?
Well, again, thanks to everybody for participating. We've got quite a turnout. We've got 84 people on. It's it's terrific. Thank you all for joining. To me, the big thing is I've been working on this for years, and what I found over the years is nobody's against apprenticeships. Like nobody. And its support for apprenticeships is very bipartisan. And obviously, there's strong support in the unionized construction sector because they have these world-class apprenticeships. They've had them for decades. And there are pockets of apprenticeships, many of which folks on the call are involved in other sectors. But what we haven't had in Maryland is a strategy. And the idea for the commission was the Senate President, Bill Ferguson's idea. He said, look, we're all for it. We want to do it, but how are we going to do it? And so that was the question put to the commission. And that's why the commission report is really long. I forget how many pages, but it's very, very long. And because it's very, very comprehensive, it doesn't cover everything. But I'll give you just a little example of one of our recommendations, which I hadn't thought of until we started looking at different sectors and thinking about this and what tools the state had. So one of the recommendations is that the State Insurance Administration should, by the end of this year, survey the insurance providers, the insurance companies, and the insurance agents, all of whom have workforce shortages, identify where there are apprenticeships now in insurance occupations, where there need to be ones, what the potential demand is in insurance. And so that's an example of a very specific thing that I'm sure people had thought of, but in Maryland, we hadn't proceeded on. I remember when we were considering it, I called up the state insurance commissioner, and said, we're thinking about this. What do you think about that? And she said, I'm all in. It's terrific. We can definitely do this. So that's what's exciting to me about this is everybody's for it, but this commission set of recommendations moves people to actually do specific things they can do.
Yeah, and I want to also just thank the senator here, because I'll tell you one of the things that was really great for me personally.
Oh, yeah, they have permissions on here.
Yeah, I had some really great, the Senator Roosevelt has been in the apprenticeship world and been a very great champion for a long time. And one of the things that's been great was we had senators, delegates who came in and said, yeah, the bill that we did before was the wrong bill. And we got to fix that bill, right? And so I think there's also this, in my world of tech, right, is like you iterate, right? You improve, right? You learn from what you did before and you make it better, right? And so there was a real openness to kind of go back and look at, okay, what didn't work in that last thing and how do we fix that going forward?
That's a great point, Jake. And what a beautiful opportunity to hear people say we were wrong about something. Like, I think there's a lot of strength in that and saying, what did we get wrong? What did we miss? Who did we miss? And build it better. And I hadn't connected that thought on software development and iteration. So thank you for that as well, because I think that's a conversation in terms of like the non-traditional apprenticeship pathways, like that we need to kind of continue to tie together that mentality of iteration and how we bring that to apprentices. Could you expand a little bit on your work in the private sector and how that might have influenced, you mentioned a little bit of this, but influenced your lens in shaping and chairing this commission?
Yeah, I think the first really was, really helping our commission understand that this is an investment by employers. This is not recruiting, right? This isn't like a recruiting model, right? And one of the hardest things for most modern corporations, right, is that, you probably have heard of the innovator's dilemma, right? Is that most corporations have a really hard time trying new things if they don't have proven ROI, if they don't have proven sort of outcomes, right? And so one of the challenges that I've always found when I was when I'm working, and I worked with very large employers, Fortune 500s, Fortune 100s, all the way down to startups with apprenticeships, was always needing to help them understand the return on the investment of the program that they were doing, right? And so this idea of actually using outcomes and longitudinal outcome data to be able to prove the ROI, and actually also building an economic model, right, and aligning that with the registered apprenticeship was a key one. So for example, in my world of tech apprenticeships, things like the mean time to the first promotion, right? Or things like obviously retention and corollary attrition, how do you use data to actually assess the real efficacy of the training and the skills? Like, how do you objectively measure the skills that a person has acquired through that process? And how do you actually track that continuation, that leveling up that happens, right? Because the thing that people a lot of times don't see is, and this is common to all apprenticeships, whether you're the trades or in tech, is that a person just entering the program is not going to be very productive, right? And so at that point, the employer is making an investment because, a first principle of apprenticeships, right? You're paid to train, right? You're paid while you're going through that learning process. So to pay an individual to go through a very direct training without them being able to produce the requisite sort of productivity gains right off the outset is an investment by definition. But in my world of tech, we were able to use data to show, well, yeah, this is an investment until you get to month 7. And at month 7, in a certain pathway, you start to see, again, this asymptotic learning that end up happening. And you start to see the productivity start to gain, right? And so how do, in my old world, how do you map, for example, compensation step-ups, right, to those competency gateways? And so, and again, how do you build an economic model that makes this investment a valuable one for employers? And so the employers who came back and became, the employers that I've had who've worked with my companies for years and years and years on these programs, yes, they may have begun as a pilot or an MVP, but it continues because it works. It continues because we were able to create a pipeline of talent that was more productive, more affordable, more scalable, and better tailored to their needs, right? that's how you got to couch this, right? It's got to become, for it to be a mainstream strategy, it's got to produce an economic benefit for your employer, right? And by the way, that applies whether you're a state government, whether you're a nonprofit or you're a for-profit, right? An employer still needs to have an economic benefit because scarce resources, right? And so that was, and so that was sort of one of the key things, right, that I think was landing this such that we couldn't just simply think about this. And look, a lot of times in my old world of apprenticeships, lots and lots of intermediaries talk about sort of the supply side of this, right? How important it is to get people trained and ready for the occupation of the future. Very seldom do they actually come from the demand side of this, right? And so coming from the demand side, understanding again, what is the alternative, right? Like anything in the commercial world, like what are the alternatives to registered apprenticeships? For a registered apprenticeship to work, it's got to be a better alternative than what's on the market. And today, the good thing was up until COVID, it was a very easy business case to make, right? Of the world of the typical traditional pathways to some of these careers of the future. I think that with technology disruption, with the whole remixing of occupations and things, there's a little bit of disruption, but I actually think the net effect on the other side of that is going to be even more apprenticeships because, the way the world's going is that all these occupations are getting remixed, redesigned, all the skills are being recombined in different ways and automated in many different ways that I think that the best, the answer for preparing the future ready workforce is to ensure that we have context-ready training that can be delivered on the job. In fact, that's one of the things I personally have come out of this whole process really advocating for is I really believe that we need to be reducing classroom training and really focusing on the job, right? You think about something like cyber, I would be advocating no classroom training in cyber, right? Day one, put a person on a cyber range, right? And start dealing with the issues and deliver the training on the job concurrent as they're working through those issues, right? I think that's the way that we should start thinking about how learning needs to change, how training needs to change, because all the occupations of the future will continually change. Everyone's going to continue to need to be leveled up. And by the way, I've seen that also in the traditional building and trades, the quote unquote traditional occupations, same thing is happening.
Yeah, thanks, Jake. And I know the commission also addressed high school apprenticeships in these recommendations. There's so many areas we can do a deep dive on everything you said, but I'm going to try to control myself and focus our conversation because we've only got about 25 minutes left. And I do want to, thinking about the folks in the room and some of the questions I've seen in the chat, I think two topics. One is the role of intermediaries. Like how do we see the role of intermediaries in scaling registered apprenticeships? And do we foresee, and this can go to Jim or Jake, kind of, how will we measure that to the effectiveness? You kind of hit on both of those. So the role of intermediaries and thinking about how we can measure that effectively.
Well, let me jump in briefly. The commission's recommendations are very strong on the role of intermediaries because whether you're a traditional union construction industry apprenticeship where you have a joint apprenticeship and training council, which is an intermediary to organizations as are on this call, you got to have intermediaries because employers have too many other things to do than to figure all this stuff out for themselves and to run it all themselves. And I think people want to be sure the intermediaries are doing a good job. And that was a discussion of some length in the commission about how do you figure that out and how do you keep track of that. And we want to do that. But I think there was broad understanding that you got to boost up the role of intermediaries. The other thing I would say is that one of that we didn't touch on, but is relevant here in terms of the politics of this, is that as we were doing the commission's work, the governor grabbed hold of a whole series of our recommendations before they'd gone public, which was fine because his cabinet members, Labor Secretary Wu and others, were on the commission, and put them into administration legislation that is going through the Senate right now, the Senate and the House right now. Which provides pay per apprentice. It provides startup costs for intermediaries coming into the state. It does a whole variety of things that come from including the procurement initiative that come from the commission's recommendations. So I think that's important to understand in terms of, that wasn't your question, but this is moving to action very quickly. Now, we're not at 60,000 apprentices yet, but the commission's recommendations and the consensus built through the commission has been taken by the governor, who was a strong supporter of, Governor Westmore was a strong supporter of apprenticeships before the commission, frankly, before he got elected governor. But he's taken a lot of it and running with it. So I think that's another outcome that's very significant and replicable in other states.
Yeah, and I'll echo that with Senator's comments, right? Is like, I mean, let's be honest, right? A lot of businesses, small and mid, just don't have the capacity to build apprenticeship programs, right, from scratch. So, but the key issue, I think, from the beginning, was the whole concept of an intermediary, right? Is an intermediary, right? And so, I think it was really first broadening that out. Is like, what is this ecosystem, right? I mean, the ecosystem of intermediaries includes, unions. It includes, companies like my own, workforce nonprofits. You got chambers of commerce. You got education and training providers. It's a pretty variety. It's a placement providers. You had a lot of the intermediary space was actually quite fuzzy. And one of the things that was really funny, I think me and one of our esteemed sort of labor presidents, after 2 years came together and we're like, you know what? We're actually in the same business, when we actually talked, because I think, and so there was a real, I think there was an expansive view of intermediaries. But all that being said, going back again to some of the key first principles, as James mentioned, is like, first, I mean, we know we need to scale up intermediaries, right? There needs to be more of them, not fewer of them. And look, I'll tell you, there was a little bit of disagreement about that, right? With some quarters of our commission. But I think we landed on like the need for better, high quality intermediaries. By the way, that's also how MORAD came into play, the Office of Apprenticeship Development, right? Is that we want to ensure the high standards that have been established by our friends in trades and traditional in organized labor continue, right? And that we can continue to maintain those as we scale up the ecosystem. But I think also part of this, I think part of the pay per apprenticeship program that we also put in place was also to ensure that when we're not creating intermediaries that are just running processes, building bridges to nowhere, right? We wanted to make sure that we have intermediaries that are connected to outcomes that really, again, make it so that we can get people across the bridge to get to truly successful careers that last a lifetime.
That's great. Thank you, Jake. Thank you. It's super helpful. I do want to ask one more question because I think it's come up a few times and I think it's on everybody's mind. It's the funding question. And I think the unpredictability, and we have Avonette here, so I want to get to her in a minute, but I do want to give Jim and Jake a chance to kind of talk about how the commission looked at funding, throughout these recommendations, and then, kind of what's the short-term and long-term view. And for folks who are joining us nationally, obviously this is a Maryland perspective, but perhaps there's a model here that we can play off of nationally. So Jake and Jim, your
Maybe
financial
maybe I can jump in on this one. So Maryland for several years has had a pay per apprentice program, and I give Chris McClarion and Secretary Wu and others in the Labor Department credit for that. They went after federal money, one of those grants that so many people have gotten, and they used a significant part of their most recent grant to create a state-based pay per apprentice program. And so they've driven it. And so they presented it to the commission, explained how it worked. And that's the basis for our scale up of pay per apprentice. And that is, as I mentioned, in the governor's legislation this year, it lays out increasing the scale of and continuing indefinitely a pay per apprentice in Maryland. Now, the amount of money involved will be dependent on how many apprenticeship sponsors show up to be paid. If there aren't very many, the state's not going to put a lot of money in it. But we put aside before the commission $25 million in a reserve account to be startup costs for the recommendations of the commission. And so the governor's proposed taking that $25 million together with some other money and committing it over the next 2 years to begin the process of scaling up our pay per apprentice program. In addition, Labor Secretary Wu, who is a big champion of intermediaries, and so there's a separate piece of funding that is in the governor's bill, it's in the budget, that is focused basically on intermediaries to put together apprenticeship programs. Basically, I call it startup costs, as opposed to pay per apprentice. So there are two different pots of money. For FY26, the year coming up, it's $5 million for each, and then it's $5 million for the next year. And then we'll see who shows up. If nobody shows up, we're not going to increase the funding. If a lot of people show up, we're going to have to increase the funding. So the proof is going to be in the pudding.
I'll just put a plug too that I was very lucky that we have the senator. The senator is the vice chair of the budget committee at this. In this, so he understands how this world works really well.
Nice.
Yeah,
Thanks.
absolutely. Now, we can't do this without funding, and we can't do this with, when you can't figure out that funding road without an expert like Jim and other folks who've been on the commission. So, Jim and Jake, I want to thank you both for your time, and please hang out. There might be more questions, but I want to transition us now to kind of, again, that practitioner lens and bring in Avanette Blanding, who's the CFO of the Maritime Applied Physics Corporation and is also a leader in the Maryland Association of CPAs and AICPA. So she wears a lot of hats, including webinar presenter today and speaker for us. So thank you for joining us. And then obviously she served on the commission too in a really important capacity.
Man, about time.
About time. So anyway, Avanette, would be grateful if you can kind of give folks an overview and share a little bit about your unique perspectives regarding apprenticeships.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you all today and just share some information and background. So I am, as Adrian said, the CFO at Maritime Applied Physics Corporation and also do some work with the MACPA and AICPA. I'm very passionate about the pipeline for accounting, the accounting career. So my focus was on a non-traditional apprenticeship in the finance and accounting area. And I also work for an employer that's a manufacturer, and we have an apprenticeship program that was started several years ago for our production shop area. So I have different perspectives on being an employer, promoting an apprenticeship program in-house, finding apprentices that are interested in participating and going through the process of developing the program, some of the administrative hurdles, so to speak, and things to consider. But I've also seen on the finance side, participated with the AICPA and the MACPA in connecting with young people who are interested in completing the apprenticeships. So it's a great opportunity.
Thank you for that. And again, yeah, I appreciate your traditional, non-traditional perspective but just broadly that career pathway for folks from all these different angles. Yeah, I appreciate your perspective there. I mean, you started to hint at this. Do you want to name some of the tension points that you've noticed from your perspective, either from developing a program with AICPA and MACPA and or the manufacturing perspective?
So on the manufacturing side, as an employer, we were having a talent shortage. It's a challenge to find talented people who can join a company and grow with the company. And we do engineering work. We also do manufacturing production. We weren't having any issues finding engineers, but we were having challenges finding our laborers and our technicians. So we did a lot of work. The president of the company at the time decided to start an apprenticeship program in-house so that we could grow the talent. What we found, unfortunately, was that getting the apprentices to commit was a challenge as well. Part of that being that within our company, once an employee started, there were many opportunities for advancement, and they didn't have to complete the apprenticeship program. So we still invested a lot in training and education and mentorship, just not a registered traditional apprenticeship. So even though we had the program, there were employees that were getting the benefits that they would get from an apprenticeship without having to complete the apprenticeship program. So as an employer, I think that's a lesson learned for us. I think a lot of employers, some of it is awareness, whether it's for the employer or the apprentice, knowing what is available out there and seeing it as an opportunity. So what we understand is that the apprenticeship may not be the answer. It's not the only answer, but it's an option. And it's not for everyone, but it's a great option for many people who won't take a traditional path into a career.
Thanks for that. And we'll note that that was one of the recommendations of the commission too, was marketing registered apprenticeship and making sure folks, I don't know if that was you or somebody else on the commission, but definitely I've heard that and echoed in several places. And if folks have questions for Avanette, please toss them in the chat. But I'll just to offer another question, I guess. I guess like from your perspective as a finance expert, are there other financial considerations that employers should consider or intermediaries should consider when thinking about the switch to registered apprenticeships? Any of the tax incentives or grants programs that you all have navigated?
Absolutely. So although we, as an employer, we had a budget for training and education, and we had a mentorship program, being able to get funding to cover the cost, it's always great. I don't know too many people, whether it's a business or an individual, who, if given the opportunity, can have funding to cover something, would say, oh no, I don't want the funding. I'll just pay for it all myself. But I think as businesses consider starting a registered apprenticeship program, really thinking about, what do you already do? So if you're already investing in training and education, perhaps some of those funds, you could say, instead of it being used for the traditional pathways, some of those funds could be used to supplement an apprenticeship program in addition to any federal or state funding that's available. I also think it's a mutually beneficial relationship. So the employer can't only think about the employer side of things, also think about what the benefit is to the employee. Same thing with the apprentice. It's not just about you, it's about the value that you provide to the company as well. And I think as we think about funding, it's an investment, but it's also a return on investment later on. Although I didn't participate in a traditional registered apprenticeship program, I did participate in an internship, a long-term internship program when I was in college, and I was able to get 4.5 years of on-the-job training in the finance department, and made lifelong connections. Also, it was a huge impact to my career. So on the non-traditional pathways, I think we can definitely look at other careers where an apprenticeship could be a viable option, because not everyone is going to take the traditional 4-year degree route.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think you just named something that we haven't named explicitly, is the social capital that this gives apprentices that they might not otherwise have access to. So really appreciate you kind of naming that triple bottom line: the apprentice wins, the employer wins, and then our economy wins when we're investing in this. Appreciate that. I see Jim has his hands up. And if any other folks have questions, now is the time to put them in the chat or raise your hand, but you couldn't beat Jim. So you're first, Jim, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I wanted to just do a shout out to Avanette and to the AICPA, because they're a great example of an intermediary, big industry, professional association, ties to employers. I mean, they're like a perfect example of what we want to do across industries and occupations. They created their own nationally registered apprenticeship in business and finance. They then came to Maryland, and under our little pay per apprentice program, they were one of the first beneficiaries of pay per apprentice. And then they now have, because in Maryland, and I want to be sure we don't forget this, is Jake said at the beginning, one of the impetuses for this was our education reform law, which says we want 45% of our high school graduates to include the high school level of registered apprenticeship. That's great for the kids, but it's also greatly expands the labor pool and reduces the recruitment costs for employers, because high school students, almost by definition, are like the whole universe of potential workers. And so now AICPA has come in to register at the state level with apprenticeships that can start in high school. And so for those who are on the call who may be interested, that's a big priority in Maryland. And I think it's a huge opportunity. And in the case of AICPA, they have their own related instruction, which is terrific. but other folks don't necessarily have their own RTI. And one of the things that is in our education law, and we're moving on, converting our high school career and technical education into RTI for registered apprenticeships, which reduces the cost for employers in addition to expanding the recruiting pool. So I just want to be sure we mentioned that before we signed off.
Thanks, Jim. Excellent shout out. Absolutely. Any other questions for our, I see Harry has his hand up. Harry, this is your webinar. You don't have to have your hand up.
I've got a question for Ava and then one for all three of you. For Ava, you mentioned the return on investment for the employer. Is there anything you're particularly excited about through the commission in terms of kind of data evidence, getting that information out there? And then secondly, for all three of you, having gone through this process, 2 years coming up with this strategy, what advice would you give to other states thinking about going through a similar process about how to do it?
I'll answer your first question. I'm very excited about the data that will be collected and shared. One of the things that we talked about in the commission, and I know for myself, joining the commission as someone in industry who wasn't really involved at the state level in apprenticeships. I had a lot of involvement on the CPA side because the pipeline is a passion of mine. But just seeing the amount of work that's being done within the state on apprenticeships, and that's where the marketing side became very important. But as we talk about trying to reach the goal of the 60,000, I think Chairman Chu would say, I often ask the question of how do we get there? How many students does that mean? How many people? Where's the data? How can we find all of this information and see how do we measure ourselves? How long is it going to take for us to truly get there? There's one thing to have a goal, but then you need a roadmap. And the commission members were all very much interested in identifying what that roadmap could be and thinking about some of the challenges and identifying ways that we can measure our performance. And there's a lot of data. There's a lot of data available. So there will be a lot of insight that will be available to the public, to the state, to see where do we go? Because I would hope that we're not just going to stop at 60,000, that we'll continue and say that this is unlimited. We're going to continue to grow.
Thank you. Demetrius.
Yes, hello again. So this is a question to anyone who wants to answer. Was there any consideration or discussion around using statewide contracts, or at least a set aside when issuing statewide contracts for apprenticeships or workforce development training type organizations when it comes to those contracts?
Yeah, that's a great question, Demetrius. I'll answer that because that's near and dear to my heart. So I think one of the things that is different about how we approach this was we see workforce as an economic development opportunity, right? So this strategy isn't just workforce, this is really economic development. And when you start thinking about that, so, we like to joke sometimes in our state, we're a state of eds, meds, and feds, right? So it's education, it's health, career, and life sciences, and it's, federal, right? It's government. And so when you start looking at that sector, so let's look at the world of government. And actually, this goes to the heart of the procurement strategy. So why did we talk about procurement, and why did I think that was the one thing that could change everything, that could be a catalyst? Was number one is, first, the state again could be a better customer that can increase adoption of apprenticeships, right? And the work that I think our state spends $16 billion a year, I think, on IT, right? And so that alone, right? But on the flip side of that, there also is this world of what is going to be a competitive advantage for a small business in Maryland, right? And you look at the world of set-asides and you look at the world of full and open primes. Well, the set-aside world, how do you differentiate, right? How do you differentiate compared to a big coming in there, or mid-tier who's not is that you can tap into a different workforce, right? And you can actually leverage this strategy now. You can become a sponsor of a registered apprenticeships, or you can hire registered apprenticeships in the delivery of work, and you will get a leg up over companies that don't, right? And so this becomes another way for a small business to compete on a more level playing field with some of the more incumbent players. And look, there's a real recognition coming into this process in our state that because of COVID, all tech had gone remote. There's a lot of the work that was being done here is being done out of state and being done by, you know, non-apprentices, non-state-based workforces. So a key part of this procurement, you know, sort of strategy is really around how do we create more state-based strategies? How do we incentivize businesses that are going to invest in the workforce in our state? And more importantly, like, how do we actually enable small businesses to compete on a more level playing field compared to incumbents?
Yeah, thanks for that, Jake. And sorry, Demetrius, we are at time. I want to give Harry a chance to sign off because obviously this conversation could go for weeks. But we will check out AFA, and MWA will be putting out other webinars in the future because these conversations are really important. Harry, let me pass it over to you.
Thanks, Adrian. I'll close this up. Just say a massive thank you to Jake, Jim, and Evanet for talking about all your work, and I thank you for the work. It's a brilliant report. We'll share it around members. You know, beyond everything that you've heard today, there's a huge amount of analysis. It's over 100 pages long. There's lots of detail on those recommendations, so it's a really useful resource. And yeah, please follow up with us from AFA. We're always happy to get involved in conversations like this in other states. Adrian, I'm sure you say the same in Maryland. But yeah, please follow up with any unanswered questions or bigger questions. And thank you all for coming today.
Thanks a lot.